Well, that's very nice. My children used to quiet down like that when I approached. The same way. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Mahegan. I'm the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Hingham Public Library. And I want to welcome you to the 2018 Harold and Avis Goldstein Lecture, a series sponsored by the library and supported by the Goldstein Trust. We are more grateful than we can say to Avis Goldstein, a legendary public school teacher in Hingham, for her generosity in creating this event to enrich our community life on behalf of herself and her husband, Hal. Hal Goldstein, for those of you who did not know him, was a long-time and is greatly missed library trustee, and with Avis, a lover of the humanities, and a dedicated supporter of all the good things that a modern public library provides. Thanks to people like Avis and Hal, and many of you, the Hingham Public Library is the center of the community. So let me say again, I can't see her because it's dark, but let me say again, as we said last year, Avis, we love you and we thank you. We owe a debt of thanks also to Derby Academy, a part of the town of Hingham since 1784. Derby has generously provided this superb space today, as it did for last year's lecture, as well as staff support with lights, sound, and parking, and we see Derby folks in the audience as well. On behalf of the library and our 13,000 cardholders, to Head of School Joe Perry, CFO Phil Cantillon, and the other Derbyites who have helped, please accept our sincere gratitude. A thank you. A thank you is also due to our friends at Buttonwood Books in Cohasset for handling the purchases for the book signing today, which will happen on the other side of the stage after the lecture. Books may be purchased in the lobby. A special thanks to Library Trustee Joanne Mitchell for her flower arrangements today. When I saw the floral arrangements for the royal wedding, I thought it looks like Joanne was here. So Joanne, thanks for the beauty and the color, just right for today's subject. Speaking for the Board of Trustees, I have to say that we are enormously grateful to our own excellent library staff. From Director Linda Harper, Assistant Director Anna Byrne, to the other library pros who have helped us with this event and help you in so many ways every time you visit or use our great library. Thanks to you all. Finally, let me welcome our friends in the Hingham Historical Society who are here today. Located in the old Derby Academy building on Main Street, that venerable society into its second century preserves and enriches the historical consciousness of this ancient town. We value their friendship and we admire their good work, so welcome. I can scarcely express my excitement and delight in introducing our speaker this afternoon. Jane Kamensky is the Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard University and the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Director of the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Professor Kamensky has New York City roots, but her New England links are deep and strong. Educated at Yale, she taught for 20 years at Brandeis University, where she chaired the history department, and she also served as Marianne Lippitt Professor of History at Brown University. Professor Kamensky has a particular interest and concentration in family, culture, and everyday life in early America. Her books include The Exchange Artist, a tale of high-flying speculation and America's first banking collapse, which happened in Boston in 1809, a sort of Ponzi story before there was a Ponzi. Colonial Mosaic, American Women, 1600 to 1750, Governing the Tongue, The Politics of Speech in Early New England, and Blind Spot, a historical novel written with co-author Jill Lepore. Her most recent book, and the basis of today's program, is A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley. This book has won a number of awards, including most recently the Nonfiction Award of the Massachusetts Center for the Book. To most of us who have read widely in colonial history, the story of John Singleton Copley is one we think we know. There is a statue in the middle of the square named for him, not in his lifetime, in his native city. There are his extremely familiar portraits of figures of the Boston phase of the American Revolution: Samuel Adams, John Hancock, John Adams, John Hancock, British General Thomas Gage, Dr. Joseph Warren, and of course, with his glistening teapot, Paul Revere. We know he was born here, that he painted these and other famous men and women, then left for England and never came back. In the writing of Jane Kamensky, the living person at the center of this skimpy storyline deepens and comes alive, as much as any person captured in paint. Boston was only the first phase of Copley's long career, most of it in London, where he created an enormous body of work, including portraits, biblical scenes, and historic events of the early 19th century. But there is much more to the Copley story than painting, as suggested by the title of today's lecture. His is the story of a humane, gifted artist trying to establish himself and support his family in a place, in a time, torn by furious partisanship, a time when everyone was expected to take sides. In those years leading up to Concord and Lexington and Bunker Hill, I'm guessing he must have been in social occasions, as all of us have been, where someone said, "Can we not talk about politics tonight, please?" For him, as for so many others, exile had its benefits, but also its costs. I must tell you, you're in for a fascinating hour. Julianne and I have heard Jane speak, and we know why she won several awards for excellence in teaching. We have also read A Revolution in Color, and I can attest that it is a moving story, superbly researched and beautifully written. For this year's Harold and Avis Goldstein lecture, Art and Revolution, The Predicament of John Singleton Copley, please join me in welcoming Jane Kamensky.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, for such an extraordinarily gracious introduction. I have talked about Copley all over the United States and some other English-speaking places too, and I have never been as well treated as I have been by the people connected with this lecture. So thank you to David and Julianne, to Linda Harper, and especially to Avis Goldstein, whose love of art and humanity is thoroughly contagious. It's very special to be talking about Copley's world here in his backyard, near the greatest collection of his work in the world, which is at Boston's MFA. I want to talk in part about how that came to be, about how that collection came to be there. It's less obvious than it seems. And about Copley's America and our America today, which were very different places. I'm going to start with the idea of revolution and this quote from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, whose definition of revolution in the mid-20th century is one that I think forms a kind of mind's eye picture when we think of that word today. Revolutions, she writes, are the only political events which confront us directly and inevitably with the problem of beginning. For revolutions, however tempted we may be to define them, are not mere changes, but entail starting with a new beginning, a complete change of society. So this emphasis on beginning the world anew, on the violation of the immortal wisdom of Ecclesiastes, that there was no new thing under the sun. Jefferson in 1801 famously said, actually, there is, and it's America. This sense of revolution was not Copley's sense. My talk this afternoon is, in fact, a circle, beginning and ending with this picture, which you'll also see several times in between. And that's partly because Copley, like many of his generation on both sides of the Atlantic, cleaved to an older sense of what revolution meant, a circular sense based in Enlightenment science and centered on revolving, not always staying the same, but a putting right and resuming in one's proper place. Copley embraced a degree of innovation, but not wholesale invention. He believed, though he didn't quite put it this way, more in evolution than in revolution. This is Copley's grand picture of his family. It was painted during the Revolutionary year of 1776. It was on his easel that spring. A diarist from Salem, like the Derbys, noted seeing it in Copley's painting rooms on April 1st, unfinished, with the likenesses just coming clear, which means it takes only a little bit of poetic license to place it there on the 4th of July. This was the largest and most complex picture that Copley had ever painted, about 10 times the size of his more familiar bust-length portraits in Boston. It contained his whole affective world, his beloved wife, Suki, there with her little silk-clad foot on a tuffet, in a pose that mirrored Correggio's Madonna of St. Jerome, which Copley had just copied over several painstaking months in Parma, Italy. We can see his stern-faced father-in-law, Richard Clark, who made everything about the picture possible on the one hand and inevitable on the other. In the background, directing the scene, you can see the artist himself, wearing deep green velvet and trailing a long romantic queue of his natural hair down the back. This was the sort of artist's fashion. And then 4 children depicted in the playful fashion of the day, though one of them, by the time Copley had painted this, was dead, never known by his father, and buried an ocean away. The setting in the background of the picture is vaguely Italianate. It recalls the background in his painting, The Ascension, which Copley had created the previous year in Rome, in a kind of mystical dialogue with Poussin and especially with Raphael's Transfiguration, about which he wrote a great deal in his letters. But if the setting in the background of the painting resembled Italy, the setting of the painting was London. Copley's easel was set up in elegant rented quarters at 12 Leicester Square, just around the corner from the studio of Sir Joshua Reynolds and near the British Museum in the respectable West End. All spring long in 1776, people came and went from the painter's new home, talking about the great subject of the day, the American War, debating pamphlets for and against. The day that the Salem Tory Samuel Kirwan stopped by and saw this family portrait on Copley's easel, he had carried with him a new pamphlet entitled An Enquiry as to whether the guilt of the present civil war in America ought to be imputed to Great Britain or America. America was the author's answer. A few days later, Kirwan picked up Richard Price's observations on the nature of civil liberty, which he thought was unjust, and fell in on America's side. Here's how Copley described the war with America when he first learned about the fighting in Lexington in July 1775, 3 months after shots were fired. The flame of civil war is now broke out in America, and I have not the least doubt it will rage with a violence equal to what it ever has done in any other country at any time. When we think of civil war, we tend to think of the opposite of revolution, of an expression of spasmodic violence with unpredictable consequences, distinctly unprogressive, unrighteous, not the kind of new beginning that we look for in the word revolution. And yet civil war is exactly what Copley and many of his Boston countrymen experienced with the fighting in the future United States. At the same time that many people Copley knew in Boston were actively calling a nation into being in a declaration that used verbs like dissolve and assume and publish and declare and pledge, Copley was reveling in a kind of happenstance, casting himself not as an agent of revolutionary destiny, but as an unwilling recipient of it, not as a declarer of independence, but as a creature of interdependence, an enmeshment of calling and character and family that had taken him from the edge of the British Empire to London, its center. And you see him here talking about how he's very glad he left when he did. We'll come back to the moment of his departure in June of 1774, because if he had stayed any longer, it would have been hard to get away, and if he had left any sooner, it would have been harder to decide not to come back. But this is the joy of revolution for Copley. Now there is no choice left. When we look at the world of the American Revolution through Copley's eyes, we don't see a revolution in Hannah Arendt's terms or in Jefferson's, but rather a very different mixture of dependence and independence, of choice and accident. Copley shows us this blend in especially sharp relief, chiefly because he was a painter whose acuteness of vision created a lasting material legacy. But as the historian Kathleen Duval has recently argued in a towering book called Independence Lost about the revolution in the Gulf Coast, I would strongly recommend the book. This is quoting Duval. Being independent would have been unwelcome to most people in 18th century North America. Men and women depended on a web of economic, social, and political connections that provided stability and opportunity. For most, advantageous interdependence was a more logical goal, end quote. John Singleton Copley's pursuits of interdependence are my subject today. But I also want to think with you about how looking at his particular and in many ways peculiar story can challenge the way we understand the American Revolution as a whole. Copley spent the first 38 years of his life in Boston, which began calling itself the cradle of American liberty as early as the 1790s. By the centennial of 1776, in 1876, Boston's slogan was all but trademarked, part of not only the city's sense of itself, but of its tourist economy and its fine arts scene, including the brand new Museum of Fine Arts, which opened that year on July 4th, facing an open plaza that in 1882 came to be called Copley Square. Beginning in that post-Civil War generation, Copley's work came to play a role in the civic and national narrative of the United States. We might say that Copley's Paul Revere was a baby in the cradle of liberty. So I'll start with what, for better or worse, is his iconic work, I think arguably the second most famous face of revolutionary America after George Washington's, whom Copley never painted, which I think was a loss on both sides. Copley painted this picture of the silversmith Paul Revere in 1768, a year of political upheaval in British America, following a period of relative quiet in the wake of the Stamp Act's repeal in 1766. The Revere painting, and I'm guessing that many of you have seen it in the MFA, the painting is pretty small, about 2 feet by 3, but it looms very large in our national mythology, especially here in New England. There's a kind of New England nationalism about Paul Revere. Its plainness and directness, its extolling of the value of honest work and the role of the individual in forging an American sensibility, an American republic which relishes being a nation of faces and of makers. Revere came into public hands in the 1930s from the family to the MFA. And once upon a time, the MFA treated it as an almost sacred object. So here's how it was shown in the rotunda, in the great rotunda connecting the two wings of the building in 1951, with the American flag on the left and the flag of the Commonwealth on the right, and Revere's Liberty Bowl in front of it. As a lapsed Catholic girl myself, I can tell you that this is an altar, right? That we have a chalice in front and steps before which we can genuflect at this sacred American text. So an awful lot has changed in American museology since 1951. And yet you can see in the spectacular new Art of the Americas wing at the museum, a trace of that altar-like presentation remains, with Revere as the high priest of revolution and his famous Liberty Bowl, an American Holy Grail, in front of him. And along the wall, receding here to the left, you see a quartet of other Copleys that David alluded to in his introduction. Closest to the front of the picture, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Dr. Joseph Warren, and Mercy Otis Warren. Painted at various moments and for various reasons during the 1760s, at the height of Copley's Boston career, they become here, beside the altar, a patriot pantheon. As my friend and colleague Jill Lepore once wrote, the 18th century super friends. The gallery is called Revolutionary Boston, which is not wrong, but it's not exactly right either. Because only in retrospect was the moment in which these pictures were made, the eve of the revolution. I had students once say that they thought Hancock might have been practicing his signature for the Declaration in this 1765 portrait, imagining that in 11 years he was going to be called on for the signature. And that's a little bit of the move that the gallery makes with that name, too. At the time they sat to Copley, not one of these men or women imagined a revolution between the American colonies and Great Britain, and certainly not any kind of conflict that would end in an independent United States. So Copley was a creature of Boston, but not a creature of the future United States. He was part of the oceanic world of Britain's Western Empire. The orientation of this 1769 printing of a 1762 map, like many North American maps of the period, performed for the ocean, so that the eastern face of the map is where all of the action is. And Copley spent his young life living in one of these little shacks on the north face of the Long Wharf, born in 1738. So literally facing the British Oceanic Empire as his backyard. He was the child of immigrants, which was relatively unusual in 18th century New England. His parents were from Southern Ireland, part of the second real substantial wave of Irish immigration to Boston in the 1730s. His father was a ne'er-do-well from Limerick. Mother was fallen gentry from County Clare. Copley's America had very different components and linkages than the United States would. Copley never set foot in the United States. His Boston was a second-tier British seaport in a world of 21 American colonies at the time of his birth that would grow to 26 after the French and Indian War, about which I'll say more in a moment. Copley's Boston, if we think about where these ships in the Bonner map are going, Copley's Boston had closer ties to Jamaica and Barbados and Nova Scotia in the first rung, to Ireland and to England, and even to the western coast of Africa than to Philadelphia or New York. There is no Acela shipping corridor in 1738. Nor was there any subgroup of 13 colonies that had any economic, cultural, political, or social logic in the time of Copley's youth. London was the capital city recognized by all of these disparate provinces. People in Copley's Boston called it home, even when they have never been there. What do you hear from home? When are you going home? Some of the first pictures that Copley copied from European prints were seascapes, like this 1754 Galatea, which languishes in storage at the MFA, and you can probably see why they're not about to hang it. It depicts, like Boston itself, an ocean world. And there are many things I want to note about this picture beyond the fact that it's pretty terrible. He's 14. Cut him a break. First of all, it's big. It's about 3 feet by 4 feet, so twice the size of Revere, which is a serious investment of time and materials to buy that much canvas and to use the pigments to cover it. It's a kind of faint copy of a copy. There's a game of telephone quality to living in Boston and thinking of London home. So it's a copy of a European print, of a European painting, which shows at once how much and how little Boston had to serve as grist for the young artist's mind. He could see the print, but he could not see the picture on which it was based. Visually, his world was quite a black and white world. Yet it's also an imperial scene. The Greek myth of Acis and Galatea, painted here, was made British by George Friedrich Handel's oratorio of that name, which was one of the most famous pieces of secular music in the Anglophone world. So here in 1754, at the age of 16, a young man of modest birth and rocky upbringing, painting himself towards the seat of empire, towards being a British artist, trying to imagine a world in color from these black and white prints. Copley's oceanic world was also a world at almost continual war. Born in 1738 means that he was born at the end of the longest period of sustained peace that would prevail for a century, though of course he couldn't know that. He lived during wartime for 45 of his 77 years. His earliest surviving works date, like Galatea, to 1753 and 1754, unbeknownst to him, the eve of the great global war that would come to be known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in America. The 7 Years' War created an enormous traffic in soldiers and imperial bureaucrats. Merchants made fortunes on that traffic in Boston. The first time Copley's young world burst into color, the color was the red of redcoats. Between 1755 and 1760, he snagged a number of important commissions from soldiers and statesmen who wanted, as Major George Scott did, whom you see in this painting, to show themselves wrapped in the scarlet uniform of the British Empire. These paintings haven't gotten a lot of attention because they're formulaic, as military portraiture tends to be. But in my book, I put a lot of interpretive weight on the opportunity of the 7 Years' War for a young provincial British artist who wanted to break the frame of the local. The strategies that these paintings tested, the social networks that they created, the skills they built, all became crucial to Copley in the post-war world. The 7 Years' War reinforced the imperial framework, made the colonies more British than they had been before. The 7 Years' War also created imperial ambitions in many people who would not have thought of their local New England lives as feeding so ineluctably toward the center as they did afterwards. The 7 Years' War is often called the war that made America, and it's the war also that made Copley. Copley's military commissions continued past the end of the 7 Years' War, and the most important of those post-war redcoats, historically, biographically, and pictorially, is this dramatic 3/4 length portrait that he painted of General Thomas Gage. who was the commander-in-chief of the British Armed Forces in America in the 1760s and early 1770s. We know within about a 2-week window of when Copley began it, the painting closely followed the landing of the Redcoats in Boston in September of 1768, which is not within months of the time that he painted Revere. So Revere also gave us the engraving, the famous engraving of that Redcoat landing, the sort of tide of red coming down the Long Wharf. This is what the Redcoat still means to Copley at the time. Colonial Americans very much loved redcoats until they decided they were agin 'em. The Gage painting is a canvas that could not be more different from Revere. It's a military portrait that follows the example of some of the great Sir Joshua Reynolds' most famous works, which circulated in engraved form, as well as Boston painter John Smibert's images of the heroes of Louisbourg from the middle of the 18th century. Gage stands with an officer's ramrod bearing in the buff waistcoat and blue-faced scarlet jacket of a general's undress. He holds a wooden baton that signifies field command and points to an enormous red-coated fighting force drilling in uniform phalanxes in a distance. He's bathed in light, his ranks are orderly, blue sky dominates the horizon, signs that, as Gage told Lord Hillsborough that summer, the presence of the troops has already produced some good effect. The Gage Commission and connections to the general produced Copley's trip to New York in 1771, which in turn followed military linkages because the society in lower Manhattan around Fort George was the high society of the city. Many of the commissions Copley painted in that whirlwind 6 months that he spent in New York, some of them now lost, were paintings of Gage's fellow officers and their wives, including this one of Captain John Montresor. War and occupation made the world open to a man who was born when and where Copley was born. The network of sea captains and merchants who carried his work east to London beginning in 1765 and that carried Copley himself there in 1774 followed the warp and weft of red-coated uniforms that began in the 7 Years' War. So a counterfactual. Without the 7 Years' War and the connections and ambitions it created, I wonder whether Copley would have begun by late 1764 or early 1765 to think about the question that dogged him for the next decade, which was how his work would stand up to the competition at home and whether he ought to follow it there. He sent this painting, which came to be known as The Boy with a Flying Squirrel, to London in September of 1765, in the immediate wake of Boston's Stamp Act riots, an early indication that the peace that followed the 7 Years' War would be more costly to the empire than the fighting. Painting and planning that entire year of 1765 and maybe longer, building up a network of sea captains and other conduits to get the picture to the annual spring exhibition of the Society of Artists of Great Britain, Copley used his war contacts. The Society of Artists itself represented a kind of artistic nationalism that started in 1760 as Britain crystallized its sweeping victory in the 7 Years' War. In late 1769, about a year after he painted Revere and Gage, Copley made the most important decision of his life. And remember, this is a man who doesn't like to make choices. He married Susanna Farnham Clark, known as Suki, who was the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant. Copley's marriage was tactical. Like everyone with any property at the time, he married for love and money and saw no contradiction between the two. It was long delayed. He was 31 at the time of his marriage and had written about how difficult it was to remain a bachelor into his late 20s, focusing on the materials of art. His marriage was a huge climb for him economically and socially. At the time of his marriage, he was a kind of soft liberty man on the Boston scene, as was his father-in-law, an importer who had been a reluctant supporter of the early colonial boycotts. Copley's distinctive family narrative: his father had died when he was around 3 and had a stepfather for only a flickering 3 years, was for most of his life an only child with a single mother and no male kin, means that a father-in-law was as close to entering a real patriarchy as Copley ever got. His marriage produced new kinds of independence for Copley and new relationships of dependency and interdependence as well. So some things that came to Copley with marriage. He got a lot of land. This is his estate on, so this is a Boston map that his stepbrother Henry Pelham drew in 1776. And the Copley holdings on Beacon Hill are large enough that they are labeled as a map feature. It comes to be called Copley's Hill. It's about 15 contiguous acres, going from Beacon Street all the way back to Charles, and what would become Cambridge Street. It is the largest single contiguous property in Boston proper at the time of his marriage. I am very happy to tell you about how he came to put that plot together later on. But by the standards of the day, independence comes with land. You cannot have independence based on retail trade. Customers are fickle. If you have land and you can farm and you can have tenants, you have independence. So he got land. He got children. Children born very regularly. Betsy followed the marriage almost exactly 9 months to the day after November of 1769. Jack Jr., as they called young John Singleton Copley Jr. in 1772, about 18 months later, and a third child again in the spring of 1773. They have extraordinarily close birth intervals by the standard of the day because Suki Copley was high enough class that she used a wet nurse, which was extremely unusual, so they were able to have their children very quickly. Slavery also came directly into Copley's life with his marriage. His growing independence and liberty was bound up with chattel slavery in that most American of contradictions, and one that Britons had begun to mock. Samuel Johnson, so famously in 1775, who wrote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" There were at least 3 enslaved people in Copley's household in the immediate wake of his marriage. And this is something that was in plain sight in public documents for 250 years, but nobody had really ever noticed because we hadn't asked questions about his social world. So he owned a young boy named Snap, who probably came from the Caribbean based on his name, and we know that Suki's father had a lot of business in Barbados, where that name was common among the enslaved. So I am guessing that Snap was a wedding present. There was a girl called Lucy, whom we know about because Copley sold her in 1771 to the Pepperell family. Her new mistress was the daughter of Isaac Royal, who was the great slaveholder of New England with a force of bondsmen and bondswomen that was on the scale of his native Antigua. There was an older boy or a young man called Cato who married in Boston in the 1770s and left a record that way. I don't know much about who this man is, but it's clear that he was known intimately to Copley when he created this oil study in 1778 in London. It's a very familiar seeming image. It was known in the family as, quote, head of a favorite Negro, and it stayed in the family into the 1860s, so it was a picture that they prized. It's a study picture. It becomes a study for the central figure in Watson in The Shark. I was unable to determine if Copley retained black servants in his later life in London. They would have been free in London. But it's clear, and I'll come back to this at the end of my talk, that slavery continues to ramify through his story of liberty, another kind of interdependence. Marriage also provoked Copley to take for the first time a trip abroad, which is what he called his sojourn to New York in 1771. So New York is abroad and London is home. Among the 36 paintings he churned out in a mere 6 months was this spectacular likeness of Margaret Kemble Gage, the general's wife, which Copley called the greatest female portrait he had ever made. It's in San Diego now, in an obscure little museum in Balboa Park, and it is worth the trip. So his marriage portion: land, love, chattel slavery, travel, and tea. Richard Clark's trade in tea was one of the things that made him the rich father-in-law that he was. In the summer of 1773, after the Tea Act, after Parliament passed the Tea Act, Richard Clark's son Jonathan, Suki's sister, and Copley's brother-in-law was in London and angling to get one of those valuable licenses to sell East India tea in the colonies. And he wrote to his partners that he had been so lucky that he had gotten one of the only 3 licenses that had gone to a Boston merchant. So that on December 16th of 1773, when make-believe Mohawks dumped 347 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, the largest single consignment of tea, at least 100 chests, belonged to Copley's father-in-law. "This is the most magnificent moment of all," wrote John Adams in his diary the next morning. "This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I cannot but consider it as an epocha in history." We quote this passage in Adams's diary all the time. It's in the textbook that I'm a co-author of. Less often do we quote the sentence that follows. And this is Adams again. "Many persons wish that as many dead carcasses were floating in the harbor as there are chests of tea." And he went on to name the governor, the customs men, and the consignees of those shipments. They deserved what was coming to them, Adams thought. Copley's father-in-law was one of them, was the chief of them, next only to Thomas Hutchinson among the deplorables. After December of 1773, Copley's marriage became the most important decision in his life in a new way, a different one than he had anticipated. He turned out to have married his politics and ultimately his citizenship. For all these reasons, family, war, calling, empire, and only a smidgen of ideology, the American Revolution led Copley home to London, to the place where the family portrait sat on his easel in the spring of 1776, while his Boston neighbors, including some of the men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, whom he had painted and whom he had grown to despise, had begun drafting a document declaring the independence of a nation that Copley would never share or never even see. Lived and read and seen from London, Copley's Revolution was Britain's American war, a no-choices-left war, and soon a losing war. Copley's art in London was the art of winning by painting losing. He was able to paint as he could not possibly have done in British America or in the new United States. His pictures got large and busy, complex and vivid, public art that required public patronage, academic art that required academic training. The dilemma, the predicament, and the opportunity of London was how to paint the irresistible subject of the day to good effect. And this became Copley's niche. The American War, however much he tried to escape it, remained his great and defining subject, his claim to artistic bona fides and public attention, his springboard into respectability in the London art world, and also his millstone. The American Revolution is, in one way and another, the subject of all of his great London pictures, of Watson and the Shark, which made his metropolitan reputation in 1778, of the death of the Earl of Chatham, which convulsed tens of thousands of public-paying customers in 1781, and the enormous and very belated Siege of Gibraltar, in which he was still trying to make the subject command attention in 1791. I'm happy to talk about any of those in the Q&A, but here I want to spend just a little time with another, the third of Copley's American War paintings, and I think the greatest history picture he ever did. So this is the death of Major Pearson. It hasn't been to the United States in several decades. It hangs in Tate Britain. It celebrates a battle and even a theater of the American Revolution that you have probably never considered, the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. The battle, such as it was, took place in January of 1781. It featured no North American combatants, and this is important to the way that Copley represented the war. The British are his heroes, but the Americans were not his enemy. In fact, this battle featured no official enemies at all. A British garrison defended itself against a rump group of French legionnaires who were out looting, and whom the government in Paris disavowed immediately. The engagement lasted 15 minutes. The governor of the Isle of Jersey was court-martialed for his dereliction. In fact, I think it's the trial in London that brings Copley the faces to paint that he's able to take sketches of later on. A gallant young major, Francis Pearson, died in the battle. Nobody had ever heard of him. London newspapers had to remind the English public not only who Major Pearson was, but where the Isle of Jersey was, and why it was important, the answer to which is, better we should have it than the French. So one of Copley's greatest paintings celebrates the heroism of a minor major in a theater that didn't matter, in a war that Britain had lost by the time Copley began the project in early 1782. I think there's something about the way that he had to thread the needle of art and politics that really comes clear in this painting. The picture was exhibited in 1784 after the Peace of Paris, which created the United States and declared that Copley's America, that oceanic world of 26 British provinces, was gone. In one of the most striking passages in the painting, Copley celebrates what people of the day called British liberty. Avenging Pearson's death, we see a servant of African descent shown in dramatic blue livery. The documentary record reveals who this figure actually was, a young man enslaved in the Carolinas who went behind British lines and followed the English army to a kind of freedom, first in the North American theater and then in this odd English Channel front. He wound up in London as a hairdresser, which was a skilled trade inconceivable for a black man in the southern parts of the early United States. Painting this hero, Copley tells us that Britain was winning the war to embody liberty, even as it lost its rebel colonies. There again, the interdependence of liberty and slavery in Britain's conception of itself and in the fighting and waging of Copley's war. The other really startling passage in the death of Pearson is this group of civilians that we see at the front right of the picture plane, almost running out of the plane. Really unusual in battle painting to see civilians fleeing into exile. The models for these people were Copley's son, John Jr., his wife, Suki, with her distinctive profile, their new baby who would not survive her childhood, and one of their maids. And they really were exiles fleeing war into London. So futurity is what they called thinking ahead. And Copley, when he got word of Lexington and Concord and was writing those letters back to Henry, asked this question: how short a way do we penetrate into the secrets of futurity? In other words, how good a guess can we make about how it's actually going to turn out? One of the things that a close view of Copley's predicament and his non-choice choices reveals is how different it is to view history facing forward rather than backward. This was especially true of the world of the American Revolution, which has come to seem in retrospect so tidy and so foreordained, almost a kind of mythic destiny for our United States. Like all of his countrymen, and indeed like all of us today, Copley saw into the future both well and poorly. For example, he was confident from the time he wrote this letter, the summer after Lexington, that when the bleeding stopped, quote, the Americans will be a free, independent people, as he put it. George Washington would not have said that in the summer of 1775. Yet Copley did not think this was a good thing. For as he went on to explain to his hot-headed half-brother, the strife would not end with independence. The country would be, he said, quote, torn in pieces twice. First, by the quarrel with Great Britain, till we have a distinct government, and then with civil discord till time has settled it into some permanent form. Whether that form would be, quote, free or despotic is beyond the reach of human wisdom to decide. I think that question is with us even now. And so Copley's advice to his stepbrother Harry was, don't pick up a gun, no matter who asks you. You don't know how it will turn out. Artistically, Copley grasped the future poorly. He hung on to the American War much too long, in part because he proceeded too deliberately and painted too slowly. I think, in fact, this is part of having grown up self-taught. He never learned to paint fast. This is Copley's last and largest American war painting, known as the Siege and Relief of Gibraltar. It's about 18 by 25 feet. I often show my students that it's the size of the floor of the entire classroom. It's complex, unseeable. It hangs now in Guildhall in a two-story gallery. It's impossible to see from anywhere in the room. And it was, in many ways, a failure. The Siege of Gibraltar began in 1779 and ended in 1782. By the spring of '83, British artists had started representing it, in part because hanging on to Gibraltar was one of the single victories of Britain in the American War. Hanging on to Jamaica was the other one that mattered. It took Copley 8 years to complete his version. The American War remained an open wound when he exhibited the painting in a tent in Green Park in the summer of 1791. A veteran committed suicide in front of it, having chosen it as a backdrop for ending a life that was ravaged by the changes in imperial preferment that came with the war. But by then, Londoners and art patrons had moved on to the next war, the one that had begun in France with the fall of the Bastille in 1789 and would continue with only brief interruption for the entire rest of Copley's life. Artistically, he missed that war, missed painting Lord Nelson. There's a summer in the mid-1790s where he has to pick between two naval heroes, the hero of the Battle of Camperdown and Nelson. And he's like, I'm going to go with the Camperdown guy. I can paint him better. I know him. So he missed painting Nelson, who became the meal ticket for British painters of the 1790s, much as George Washington was for those on the other side of the Atlantic. So that's a kind of embodiment of his predicament. To miss Nelson in the East and Washington in the West is really a sort of no man's land. Copley hung on to what for Britons was a mercifully fading memory of the loss of America, hung on to his own American losses too. He really chewed over the fate of that Beacon Hill property. The realm in which Copley best grasped and most fully was the architect of his own future was in the realm of family. The aimlessness of his politics was matched by the deliberateness of his family strategy. When he was touring Italy in 1774, he had said that his highest goal for his formidable ambition was to bring his children into the great world of London with reputation. A core commitment of my book is to take this seriously, to keep family strategy at the center of his life, as Copley told us it was. This was perhaps an American goal to bring his children into the world with reputation, the goal that they would rise above their station as he had risen above his. And in this goal, he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. His surviving son and oldest child, John Singleton Copley Jr., became Baron Lyndhurst, Lord High Chancellor, and a peer of the new creation. On the right, you see him as painted by Thomas Phillips in this stilted and elegant state portrait clotted with gold lace, one of many of the coined aristocrat. Young Copley Jr. visited the United States in 1796 and thought briefly of building a western estate here of hundreds of acres for his parents in their dotage. But he decided in the end to return to London, and for him, as for his father, the United States got further and further away. Daughter Betsy, first of Copley's children and the middle character of the family portrait, also succeeded. In 1800, at the ripe age of 30, she married back to America, but a new America, not the America of her birth, but the United States. She, like her father, married into slavery. Her husband, Gardner Green, had made a slaving fortune in the Demerara sugar plantations. She and Gardner Green lived on Beacon Hill in grand style. Their money, Green's slaving wealth, saved the Copleys in the artist's declining years and funded Baron Lyndhurst's rise into the legal profession. Betsy and her husband had a large staff of servants, including several free African Americans and at least one slave named Harry, who was also Gardner Green's son. When Green died in 1832, he manumitted Harry in his will, which means that Harry Green was one of the last, if not the last, enslaved man in Boston, and Betsy Copley Green, one of the last slaveholders. That interdependence of liberty and slavery, family and politics remaining in Copley's family to the very end. Betsy Copley lived for decades after her husband passed. This studio portrait was taken in Boston in 1862. It's a stuffed parrot, because no parrot could sit still that long. She and her brother, the Lord, and her spinster sister Mary met regularly in Europe in the 1840s. All three Copley children lived into their 90s during the Civil War, which they called a revolution, just as their parents had called the American Revolution a civil war. Lord Lyndhurst, who kept all the pictures that didn't sell, died first in 1862. When his estate and all their patrimony went under the gavel, Betsy sent emissaries to London to bid on the art. It was her agents who brought to the United States many of the MFA's Copley treasures, including Boy with a Flying Squirrel, The Ascension, Ralph and Alice Izard, Watson and the Shark, and the family picture. These works hang here and elsewhere in our American wings, and we like to think of their return to Boston and then to important museums in New York and Philadelphia, and then Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then Milwaukee and Detroit, and even Lawrence, Kansas, which is where the adult Betsy hangs. We like to think of the American journey of these paintings as a homecoming, as a repatriation of American art. But it wasn't really. Copley's America was long gone. When those paintings left Britain, they left the only country they had ever known. Today, the family picture hangs in the American National Gallery of Art in Washington, part of the cultural patrimony of the United States. But fittingly, it hangs upstairs in the West Wing, in a British and European gallery, set very appropriately alongside the works of Joshua Reynolds and George Romney, Thomas Gainsborough, and others of Copley's artistic peers who were, like him, British artists from cradle to grave. Thank you. Yes?
What became of the property that he owned on Beacon Hill?
Thank you for asking me that question. What became of the property that he owned on Beacon Hill? So that's why his son comes back in 1796 to see if they can sell the property. And the courts of Massachusetts say, sure, you can come and sell the property. Of course, to have standing in a court in Massachusetts, you have to declare yourself a citizen of the United States. Are you willing to do that? And then there's a sort of, so he comes to a deal through an agent to alienate it from him for several $1,000s. It's much more than he paid for it, but it's much less than he believes it's worth. And he goes to his grave 20 years later. He dies in 1815. He goes to his grave convinced that Harrison Gray Otis and partners have cozened him. And so it becomes all of Beacon Hill. It is the great bulk of the tract that the Mount Vernon proprietors developed into Beacon Hill was Copley's tract. And Copley had been able to afford it because he bought it without clear title, and Otis, I'm sure, knew that. And he also knew that Copley was in no way going to come back and stand for himself in a transaction. So they didn't cousin him, but they picked a seller who they knew they could buy from indirectly and at advantage. He was, you know, there are diaries in the 18-teens of some of the London Royal Academicians who knew Copley, who it sounds like he went into his golden years muttering about the loss of the Beacon Hill property. Like anybody who would listen, will you hear about? No, the Harrison Gray Otis, is the Harrison Gray Otis house, it depends on which Harrison Gray Otis house we're talking about. Mount Vernon Street would certainly have been his. No, not that far, not that far. The house that was at the site of Copley's own manor house, and the book you can, contains all the details of him turning it into this gentleman farm, and he grew potatoes there, and the reason he came to hate Hancock was partly because Hancock, who was his next door neighbor, leased one of Copley's barns and would never pay the rent. You know, I think this was a truth. This was a truth of having loyalist neighbors. You could get away with anything because there was little they could do, either because they were far or because, you know, you didn't want to call attention to yourself in Boston politics from 72 forward. So that house now is on the footprint, under the footprint of the Somerset Club at 55 Beacon.
A portable microphone has magically appeared, and Anna Barron here is volunteered to sprint around up and down the stairs to reach questioners, and so we'll take a few more.
If you had to discuss with the group of tours at the MFA, say, Copley's European experience, you have like about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Would you say it was good, bad, art better, art worse? Like, how would you put it together?
So it's a mix of all those things, as experience usually is. He believes before he departs North America that he will only become a truly great and trained painter if he can see truly great art. And that is true. So, you know, at the time he left America, if you look at some of the late pictures in the MFA, there's a dual portrait of husband and wife. He can barely figure out how to get two people in the same frame, right? He really is entirely self-taught. He kind of takes two single portraits and just sews them together, visually. So I think he would have said he grew tremendously. I mean, literally, the pictures got big. He learned the academic traditions of art. He had some big public successes. I was talking to David and Avis earlier. He was willing to take his art to the public and create public opinion, which at the time in Britain was considered shocking, right? Like, what? Critics should pronounce whether your art is good or not. What, taking it to the public? That's so American. So he had several big public successes. He never made much money. You know, if you are painting a history painting for 8 years, and that is most of your production for 8 years, there is no N of people paying a shilling a viewing that is going to pay you back. And he did not have the kind of steady patronage he had here. So here, if you were within 300 miles of Boston and you wanted a portrait, and you would because it was a way to show that you mattered in the world, the person whose portrait you would want, the person who you want to portray you was Copley. People in New York are begging him to come to New York. People in Halifax are begging him to come to Halifax. In London, there's 100 painters as good. Whether it's because of his American connections, because of his awkwardness as a courtier, because the field is too crowded, he never really cracks the nobility. So there's not a school of people who want to come to him. And I'll say one more thing. You said I could only give a 5-minute response. Another way that painters created eminence and security for themselves was by having students. So Benjamin West, who forms a kind of doppelganger in my story, was successful partly because he was a very gracious man. I think a big empty suit, frankly, but a very gracious man. And every American aspiring painter who came to London, he said, you know, come into my home and let me teach you some of the tricks of the trade and then take my name forward into the world. Copley was a sort of awkward man, and he never had any students, always finished every element of his own picture. So that's a way that he could have ramped up production, say, right? If you needed scale, you know, that's a way to get it, is by having your students finish pictures. Then you can do it in 2 years instead of in 8 years, and he never did that either. So the second half of his life had painterly glories that could not have happened here. You know, you could not have painted the death of Major Pearson in the United States until 1850. I mean, there weren't academies of art in the United States until the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But on the other hand, he lived the back half of his life in quite grinding poverty. And in the United States, he was a you know, near gentleman.
Hi, I just have some questions about his personal life. Mm-hmm. You said marriage changed his life dramatically. How did he meet his wife, and what type of relationship did they have?
So I don't know how, I know when he met her, but I don't know how he met her. He had, while Gage was in town, he had what we would now call open studio. They called it a levee. Whether that was a common practice or whether that was just when the general was in town, I don't know. So he could have met her at something like that. He had painted one of her sisters, so it's possible that you would bring a sister as a chaperone. All of her sisters had married merchants, so it's hard for me to imagine that her father was, when she said, like, I'm in love with a painter, that her father said, oh, great, you know, I've always wanted a child to marry an artist. they were in really the first generation that had a vocabulary for love marriage, and their letters are full of what sounds like extremely heartfelt affection. On the other hand, she saved all of his letters, and thank God, because that's how we're able to read them, and he saved none of hers. So I think, like all loving marriages of the 18th century, it was a partnership, but it was a decidedly unequal partnership, and you know, he was not a draconian patriarch of the old school, but the new school, you know, he was still the one standing and she was still the one sitting. I think they really did care about each other. Yeah.
Perhaps one more. See someone there.
Is there someone there? Yeah, and I can repeat your question. Oh, look at that.
Thanks. I just wondered if you could shed any light. It seems like Betsy must have been so strongly motivated to buy the paintings across, you know, the Atlantic, yes, and get them back over here. And, you know, I'm getting from what you're saying that we can't project our ideas about patriotism. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I think they were her heritage. I mean, she was somebody whose life was marked. So the question, everybody hear the question? But why did Betsy take the extraordinary, make the extraordinary efforts to get the paintings back that she did? You know, she lived a life of what can only have been traumatic rupture twice, right? Like, she's fleeing Boston after the siege. They stayed in Boston through the siege while he was touring through Paris. He'd be writing like, oh, in Paris they eat turtle soup. And she would write back, in Boston we are under siege. So she had that traumatic rupture, and then she came back with this marriage and never saw her mother again. You know, 30 years and never saw her mother again. I think there was a making whole to bringing what belonged to her back, and I also have some sense, I didn't write much about Betsy's generation in Boston, but that they were people of the old school in a new world. So when she died in the 1860s, there was a sort of oldest living loyalist dies. That they had resisted new fashions, that their house was dark like the 18th century rather than light-flooded like the 19th. And I think, you know, she wanted to surround herself with the America that he had created and that belonged to her. I don't think there was any monetary incentive to sell the stuff. And in fact, it went very cheap. You know, one of the reasons David had asked me earlier, doesn't it show that the son must have loved the painting to have kept it, but it was also quite unsaleable. This is one of the challenges of history painting is you need a public entity to commission it, and then it has to go to a palace or a great house or a museum, because nobody wants Death of Major Pearson over their couch, right? And he was not good, because he didn't have that level of patronage at the very top. There weren't really people saying, will you furnish my chapel, as West did for George III. So the paintings were left over in some ways, and maybe she didn't want them scattered to the wind as her parents had been. That's a guess. All right, thank you.